Tales with a Texas Twist. Her two newest books about Texas are 1001 Greatest Things Ever Said About Texas, published in 2006, and You Know You're in Texas When, 2007. A retired English professor turned author and storyteller, Donna has spent over 30 years as a writer and teacher of writing and over 12 years performing as a professional storyteller. Featured on the Exchange Place stage at the National Storytelling Festival in 2003. She's also performed at every major storytelling and folk festival in her home state and in several other states and in Europe. She is the 2007 recipient of the John Henry Falk Award for Outstanding Contributions to the Art of Storytelling. Ladies and gentlemen, Donna Ingham, and she's going to be reading Bigfoot, Wallace, and the Hickory Nuts from I'll Tell You a Tale.
Thank you, Bill. J. Frank Dobie was as much storyteller as he was folklorist, and that's what he said. So he felt free to adapt stories that he heard, stories that he read. So this is my adaptation of Dobie's story about Bigfoot Wallace and the Hickory Nuts. Bigfoot Wallace did have big feet, but they didn't seem out of proportion to the rest of him because he was what we call in Texas a big old boy. And of course, Bigfoot wasn't his real name. His real name was William Alexander Anderson Wallace. He was from good Scottish stock. One of his ancestors was another Sir William Wallace. He had a nickname too. They called him Braveheart. Bigfoot Wallace was a bit of a warrior himself. He was a Texas Ranger. He was an Indian fighter, and he was a storyteller. And because he was a good storyteller, he was invited a lot of times to gatherings such as this and other dinners on the ground. And when people saw that he was coming, they would rush up to him and they would say, "Bigfoot, tell us a story. Tell us about the most remarkable adventure you ever had with the Indians." And if Bigfoot thought they wanted just a little something extra on the story, he didn't mind giving it to them. Now, back in the olden days when there was a full moon, it was called a Comanche moon. The idea being perhaps that it would give enough light for the native people to go out raiding. And I always say here, to be politically correct, that they probably thought they had every right to raid those settlements because the settlers were moving in by the wagon loads and taking over their traditional hunting grounds. Nevertheless, Bigfoot Wallace did not intend for them to get his livestock. So anytime there was a Comanche moon, he would bring his livestock up, especially his horses, right up next to his cabin, where he had a stake corral, just cedar stakes driven into the ground, tied next to his cabin, or he would stake her out about 200 yards in a little clearing that was pretty well camouflaged by brush. He had a little place, by the way, not very far from here, just on this side of the Medina River from San Antonio. He was an old bachelor. He lived in a log cabin and was sort of retired by this time from his ranger activities and so forth. At any rate, because of that precaution that he took, and because he was a light sleeper, and because he had that reputation as a ranger and an Indian fighter, and because he had this pack of mongrel dogs that had pretty good noses on them, and so they would sound an alarm anytime anyone got within smelling distance, much less seeing distance, he had never lost a single head of livestock until this one November night, not long after the Civil War. The next morning he got up and he looked out. It was sort of foggy, but he could see well enough that there didn't seem to be any of his horses in that stake corral. So sure enough, he went out and he walked all the way around to the backside of that corral, and he saw that someone had cut that leather string and pulled enough of the stakes out to lay them down on the ground, and all his horses were gone. He could see their hoof prints in the soft earth, in amongst moccasin prints. Well, he went out to check and see if his horse was still in the clearing where he had staked her out. Her name was Whitebeam. And she was. The Indians hadn't found her. So he was bringing her back to the corn crib. He was going to throw his old saddle on her because he had decided he wasn't going to let the Indians get away with taking his horses. But while he was walking back, he was thinking, well, I never even heard so much as a whimper out of those dogs, much less a bark. But then he remembered that the Comanche in particular could mesmerize a dog, and that must be what happened. Well, sure enough, he mounted up, and he hadn't quite figured out what he was going to do, just one man against apparently quite a few of the Comanche. Well, he did have his muzzle-loading long rifle with him. He called it Sweet Lips. And he had his bowie knife, his big bowie knife. He called it Butch. And so he mounted up on White Bean, and he was a good tracker. And so he could just track at a gallop because, well, the Indians hadn't made any effort to cover up their tracks. So he went along there, and he finally topped a little rise, and about a mile and a half off in the distance, he could see what appeared to be smoke, maybe from a campfire, wafting up over some trees, and he thought, well, there's probably a clearing in there, and they've probably stopped to have breakfast. And then he thought, well, they might be having one of my colts for breakfast, because they did that, you know. And that made him mad. But still, he hadn't figured out exactly what he was going to do. And he realized that he had stopped right next to a little neck of the woods that was just full of hickory trees. And it was hickory nut season, and the trees were just covered with hickory nuts, and hickory nuts that were already ripe had fallen off on the ground. And he had an idea. Now, he used to tell a story about one time when he was out and he had a little fracas with the Indians, and at that point he had stopped next to a house, and that house had shutters on it, and so he got the idea of taking those shutters and putting one shutter on in front and one shutter on in back, and it was sort of like armor. But he didn't have any shutters now. But what he did have was hickory nuts. So now, he always wore the buckskins, you know, with the fringe. And what he did was, he reached in his pocket, he found some buckskin strings, and he tied the sleeves of his shirt, and he tied the cuffs of his breeches above those big feet. And then he just got off a White Bean, and he started picking up hickory nuts, and he stuffed them down in his shirt, and he stuffed them down in his pants, and he even took his hat off and put hickory nuts in there and put his hat back on. And when he got done, well, there wasn't a cubic inch between his skin and the buckskin that wasn't fortified with hickory nuts. You couldn't put a finger in there anywhere. And then he decided to mount back up on White Bean, only she was shying away from him, because by now he looked a little bit like a frontier Santa Claus. And she thought he might be a beast or something, and so he had to talk to her quite a while to calm her down. Then he had another problem, because he couldn't bend his knee to get it in the stirrup, and so he finally led her over to a fallen log so he could step up on the log, get his foot in the stirrup, ease up in the saddle. But he did sit down sort of gingerly, because even though he was a tough-hided old pioneer, those hickory nuts did chafe a little. So he rode on over to the edge of the clearing, and he just kind of rolled off of White Bean, because that's the only way he could get off. And that was back in the days when the water ran clear and the grass was stirrup high, and those are Dobie's exact words. And so he could scrunch down in that grass enough that he could get close enough to that clearing, and then he could part the brush, and he could count the Indians. There were 42 of them, counting the ones that were watching his horses. So he had to figure out what he was going to do. Well, he decided he'd try to scare them off. So he loaded old Sweet Lips, the muzzle-loading rifle, with the powder and the wadding and the ball, and it struck the flint, and then boom. Well, it did get the Indians' attention, but they didn't run. No, they were looking around, trying to see the smoke from the black powder. Well, he had time to load again, and he fired again. Boom! And this time they did run right toward him. Well, he had time to load one more time, but he thought he might ought to save that for harder times. So he did the only thing he knew to do. He just stood up in all his majesty, in all his stature, in all his hickory nuts. And sure enough, the Indians stopped and looked, and they too couldn't figure out exactly who or what this was. Was it a bear or a beast, or was it just old Big, old Patas Grandes? Because they knew whose horses they'd taken. He'd been on their trail before. Well, they talked among themselves, and they finally decided that it was just old Big, and so they started running again, right toward him, only this time they were reaching back and pulling arrows and knocking them in their bows and letting fly. Well, an arrow would hit a hickory nut, split it, fall to the ground. Hit a hickory nut, split it, fall to the ground. He said that there were enough arrows in front of him that he could step up on them and 3 inches taller. Well, the Indians realized that that frontal attack wasn't working, so they moved around to a right flank attack. Same thing. Thump, fall to the ground. Thump, fall to the ground. Well, so then they moved around for a left flank attack. Same thing. Thump, fall to the ground. Sometimes they would fire high enough they would hit him in his hat, but remember, he had hickory nuts up there too. Thump, fall to the ground. Well, finally, in their desperation, they moved around for a rear attack. And he said he did have to laugh when they would hit a hickory nut that was behind his knee because it tickled. He said he finally whirled around just as the last Indian fired the last arrow from the last quiver. And he said they all just stood there, amazed. They knew that every arrow had hit its mark. Those Comanches were fine marksmen, and yet there he stood. Well, he said without a word, they all just turned and stampeded for the Rio Grande, 70 miles away. And he said, I just stood there till they were all out of sight. And then he said, I untied the strings from around the cuffs of my shirt, I untied the strings from around the cuffs of my breeches, and all those hickory nuts just came rolling out. And every last one of them was shelled. He said, you can beat me to death with a grasshopper leg if that ain't the truth. Well, sure enough, they had one of his colts for breakfast, and he got the little hide from the colt and kind of made it into a bag of sorts, and he decided to pick up all those hickory nut meats because they'd be good for fattening hogs, if nothing else. Tied up the top of that little bag and strung it onto his saddle horn and mounted up on old Whitebeam, and rounded up his horses and made it home before dark. And that, Bigfoot would say, is probably the most remarkable adventure I ever had with the Indians.
It's a great story, Donna. Thank you very much.